A young girl vanished without a trace in the woods. Years later, a lone hunter stumbles upon an abandoned cabin holding the key to a chilling secret buried for generations. The crisp air of early October had draped the small town of Grayson Hollow in golden hues. Amber leaves danced through the streets as families decorated porches with pumpkins and hay bales. It was the season of cider, campfires, and whispered stories told under blankets. But on the edge of town, where thick forests swallowed the horizon, something darker stirred. 8-year-old Emily Carver had always been a curious child. Bright-eyed and fearless, she was the kind of girl who climbed trees barefoot, named wild raccoons, and insisted fairies lived under mushrooms. Her family owned a modest house at the foot of the Grayson Woods, a sprawling expanse of forest known for its tangled paths and haunting silence. Locals often warned their children not to venture in too deep. It was easy to get lost and harder to be found. That October day, Emily had been playing outside with her older brother, Tyler. Their laughter echoed as they played hide-and-seek near the tree line. One moment she was there, giggling from behind a fallen log, and the next she was gone. Tyler called for her, expecting her to leap from the underbrush in triumph. When she didn't, he searched. Then he shouted. Panic set in quickly. Within an hour, their mother was dialing 911, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what couldn't possibly be true. Search parties mobilized immediately. Volunteers combed the woods with flashlights and thermal gear. Drones scanned from above, while bloodhounds sniffed the air for traces of Emily's scent. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. Not a single footprint, not a single clue. It was as if she had vanished into the very trees. Local media latched onto the story. 8-year-old girl disappears near Grayson Woods. Theories circulated: an animal attack, a stranger in the woods, even supernatural causes. But none fit. There was no sign of struggle, no shred of clothing, no trail to follow. Just silence. Her family clung to hope. Tyler blamed himself, spiraling into guilt. Their mother, Mary Ann, began sleeping near the window, staring into the trees for hours each night. As days turned into weeks, then months, the search waned. The world moved on, but Grayson Hollow never forgot. Each October, a candlelight vigil was held near the forest's edge. A photo of Emily, smiling with missing front teeth and messy hair, was propped against a tree. "Come home, Emily," the townsfolk whispered. But year after year, no one came. Then, nearly a decade later, just as the town had resigned itself to silence, something changed. A local hunter, trekking deep through Grayson Woods for the first time in years, stumbled upon something strange. A structure, hidden by nature, buried beneath vines and rot. An old, decaying cabin that didn't appear on any map. Inside, he found more than dust and ruin. He found something that would reignite the mystery and shake the town to its core. Jacob Redfern had hunted these woods since he was a boy. At 52, he moved slower and breathed heavier, but there was no one in Grayson Hollow who knew the terrain better. After years working construction, Jacob had retired early, choosing to spend his days tracking deer through the forest trails that snaked behind his cabin on the eastern ridge of the Grayson Woods. For him, hunting wasn't just about the sport. It was about solitude, peace, and listening to the heartbeat of the wilderness. It was early morning, a day in late November. Fog clung low to the forest floor like smoke from an unseen fire. Jacob had followed a large buck's tracks deeper into the woods than usual, beyond his familiar paths. The air felt different out here, older, stiller. Even the birds were quiet, but his focus was sharp. He moved with the patience of a man who had nothing to prove and all the time in the world. As he pushed past a curtain of moss-covered branches, something stopped him in his tracks. There, half swallowed by time and ivy, stood a cabin. It was nearly invisible, cloaked in vines, and leaning like a forgotten grave marker. The structure was small, no bigger than a garden shed, its wood gray and splintering, its roof sagging under years of rot. Jacob's first thought was confusion. He had hiked this area countless times. This cabin wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't marked on any map. No one in town had ever spoken of it. He approached cautiously, instinctively checking the ground for signs of recent movement. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, something drew him closer. He circled the cabin once before spotting a narrow door, its handle rusted, its hinges barely hanging on. With a slow breath, Jacob pushed it open. The wood groaned, sending a cloud of dust into the light that trickled through cracks in the walls. Inside, it smelled of mildew, old pine, and something faintly metallic. The room was dark, save for thin beams of light slicing through gaps in the planks. Cobwebs clung to the corners like faded memories. An old table sat crooked in the center, and against one wall stood a small wooden cot with a tattered blanket. Jacob's eyes adjusted, and then narrowed. There were drawings, dozens of them, pinned or taped to the walls. Childlike sketches in faded crayon, depicting trees, animals, and something else, something odd. A girl, always the same girl with long dark hair, standing alone in the woods. In some drawings, she was smiling. In others, her face was twisted in fear. Jacob's heart began to pound. On the table, half buried beneath leaves and old wrappers, sat a small, weathered notebook. He flipped it open with trembling fingers. Inside were pages of uneven handwriting. The name, Emily, appeared again and again. Some entries were incoherent, as if written by a child under stress. Others spoke of someone watching, of someone who brings food but never speaks, of the man with the whisper voice. Jacob felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He backed out of the cabin, heart racing. There was no doubt now. This place wasn't just an old hunting shack or a hermit's hut. Someone had lived here, someone young, and possibly someone who didn't want to be found. He marked the location on his GPS and headed back through the forest faster than he'd moved in years. He didn't stop until the trees thinned and the rooftops of Grayson Hollow appeared in the distance. By the time the sun set, the sheriff's truck was parked outside his home, and the mystery of Emily Carver's disappearance had been reopened, with more questions than answers. Sheriff Alan Briggs had been new to the badge when Emily Carver vanished. It was his first high-profile case, and it haunted him to this day. Over the years, he had followed every lead, chased every whisper, and stood beside the Carver family during each vigil, eyes scanning the darkened tree line, heart heavy with guilt. Now in his early 60s, the weight of the badge had carved deep lines into his face, but he wore it with the same sense of duty as always. So when Jacob Redfern called him that evening, his voice tense and low, Alan listened. "A cabin," Jacob said, "deep in the woods. I've never seen it before, but someone's been there. Someone young. Maybe Emily. Sheriff, you need to see this with your own eyes." By dawn, Alan stood at the edge of Grayson Woods, accompanied by 2 deputies and Jacob. They hiked in silence. Jacob led the way, cutting through undergrowth like a man who'd walked this route in his dreams. As they moved deeper, the forest seemed to grow thicker, darker, the branches arching overhead like silent watchers. When they reached the cabin, the sheriff stopped short. He took in the weather-worn structure, the slant of its frame, the ivy creeping over its roof like fingers trying to pull it under. It wasn't just hidden, it was concealed. Intentionally. "Jesus," he muttered. Inside, they tread carefully, flashlights slicing through the dim. The drawings remained, untouched since Jacob's first visit. Alan studied them, his jaw tightening as he recognized the child's handwriting. Emily's name scrawled again and again. A crude sketch of a girl behind a window. Another of a tall man standing outside the cabin door. Then he saw the notebook. He picked it up gently, as if afraid it might crumble in his hands. Flipping through the pages, he scanned the entries. They weren't dated, but the progression was clear. The early entries were hopeful, frightened, but coherent. "I think someone will come soon," and "I heard a voice last night. I think it was Tyler calling." Later, entries shifted. The handwriting grew erratic. The lines more fragmented. "He's here again. I hid under the bed. And I miss Mommy. I miss hot food. I miss the sun." Alan felt his throat tighten. This wasn't fiction. This was a child's journal, a record of survival. "She was here," he said quietly. "She was alive." One of the deputies stepped toward the cot, and gently pulled back the tattered blanket. Beneath it was a small wooden box. Inside were a few treasures: broken crayons, a rubber band, a ribbon that matched the one Emily had worn in the photo used for her missing posters. Sheriff Briggs closed his eyes, but something else caught his attention. Near the back wall, scuffed into the wooden floor, was a mark, almost invisible. Alan knelt and brushed away dust to reveal it clearly. A set of scratched lines, forming a crude arrow pointing toward the back of the cabin. A message? A direction? He turned to Jacob. "You sure you never saw this place before?" Jacob shook his head solemnly. "Not once. And I've hunted every square mile of these woods." Alan stood, heart heavy and mind racing. If Emily had lived here, the question wasn't just how she survived, but who kept her here, who brought her food, left her alone, and vanished just as suddenly. And if she ever escaped, where had she gone? The sheriff stepped outside and looked deeper into the trees, toward where the arrow pointed. "We're not done," he said. "Not even close." The arrow etched into the wooden floor lingered in Sheriff Briggs's mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. After years of silence, this cabin had spoken, but what it said was incomplete, fragmented, as though the truth still lay hidden between the boards and shadows. He ordered the area around the cabin sealed off, with crime scene tape marking the trees in a wide perimeter. No one from the town was to come near, not until they understood what they were dealing with. Forensics would take time, and so, while his deputies began documenting everything inside and out, Sheriff Briggs stayed behind after the others left. Alone with the quiet cabin, he walked its narrow interior slowly, flashlights sweeping across dust and cobwebs. Every creak underfoot felt like a whisper. Every flicker of movement in the shadows sent his hand twitching toward his holster. But there were no animals, no wind, just the weight of memory and loss pressing in. Alan's gaze returned to the drawings, more than just a child's idle scribbles. Some are methodical, almost obsessive. One in particular caught his eye, a picture of a girl behind wooden bars with a dark figure standing in the corner. The man's face was scribbled out in heavy black crayon. But what struck him wasn't the figure. It was the shape of the room in the drawing. It wasn't the same as the cabin. The walls, they were wrong. For walls, yes, but the proportions were off. The drawing showed a space larger than this tiny structure. And there were details missing: no window, no cot, just blank walls and the looming figure. He studied the drawing more closely, heart skipping. Then it hit him. A second room. The arrow. The proportions. The strange silence behind the back wall. Alan walked to the rear of the cabin. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing obvious. But when he tapped lightly on the boards, one section gave a softer, hollower echo than the rest. He crouched, knuckles grazing the rough wood, then reached into his belt for a folding knife. He pried at the edge of the wall. The board splintered with a crack, revealing something behind it. Darkness, the faint scent of mildew, and a pocket of stale, unmoving air. He worked quickly, pulling away more planks, until a narrow opening was exposed. His flashlight cut through the void. It was a small, hidden chamber, maybe 5 feet wide. No windows, just a dirt floor and walls that had been scrawled with childlike writing. He climbed in slowly, boots crunching the earth. And there it was, a metal chain still bolted to the wall, long rusted, but unmistakably meant to restrain someone. Next to it, a threadbare blanket, torn and dirty, lay bunched in a corner. Scribbles covered the boards in thick black marker. "Please help me. I was good today. Don't make him come back." Sheriff Briggs felt something crack deep inside him. This was no makeshift shelter. This was a prison. Emily hadn't just hidden here. She had been kept. He backed out of the chamber, jaw clenched, fists shaking. He radioed for backup immediately, voice low and sharp. "We found a secondary room. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a holding cell. Someone did this to her." As he stepped outside to meet the returning deputies, the wind picked up and rustled the bare tree limbs above. It sounded almost like a cry, high, faint, and fading into silence. And for the first time in over a decade, the woods of Grayson Hollow were whispering their secrets. Sheriff Briggs couldn't sleep that night. Even after he left the cabin, Even after the scene was secured and the deputies took over logging the evidence, his mind remained trapped in that dark crawl space. He couldn't shake the image of the chain bolted to the wall, or the words scratched into the timber, "Don't make him come back." But it was the journal, Emily's journal, that kept him awake. It was now in evidence, handled with gloves and carefully sealed, but Alan had made copies of each page before he turned it over to the lab. He sat at his desk, alone in the station, reading through every line again. At first, it was all about hope. Emily had clearly believed someone would find her. She wrote about birds outside, a blue sky she glimpsed once through a crack, dreams of her brother Tyler finding her trail. But the tone changed gradually into something colder, something frightened. She never used a full name, just one word, M. He was never described in detail, only referenced. He brought food again, but he was angry today. Or, he watched me sleep. I pretended I was dead. It worked. But then, 3 pages from the end, Alan saw it. A single sentence that sent a chill down his spine. He called himself Marcus. The name sat there, alone on the page. Not a part of a sentence. Not wrapped in any emotion. Just flat. Factual. As if Emily had finally learned the truth and wanted someone to know it. Alan leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. Marcus. It wasn't a name he expected. He pulled up old case files, scanned every name that had ever been attached to Emily's disappearance. Neighbors, contractors, anyone who had worked in the area. Marcus. Marcus. There were a few entries, but only one stood out. Marcus Thorne, a reclusive man, mid-30s back then. He'd lived on the far outskirts of Grayson Hollow. Was brought in once for questioning. An anonymous tip had said he kept to himself and gave off a weird vibe. But there had been no evidence, no history of violence. After a brief interview, he was cleared and never contacted again. A ghost in the system. Alan remembered him now, pale, lean, twitchy eyes. Said he was a trapper, but they never found any licenses or permits. Back then, it hadn't been enough to hold him. But now, they had Emily's journal and the name. He pulled up Marcus Thorne's file. The last known address had long since been abandoned. The property burned down in 2018. No signs of foul play, just a collapsed chimney and years of neglect. But Marcus was never officially marked deceased. Just gone. Alan stared at the file. Gone like Emily. Gone like the secrets these woods kept so well. Then his phone rang. Deputy Claire, voice tight. "Sheriff, you need to come back to the cabin. We found something under the floorboards." His heart pounded. "I'll be there in 10. He grabbed his coat and rushed into the cold night, the wind biting through his sleeves. As he drove back into the woods, one thought burned in his mind. If Marcus Thorne had kept Emily here, where was he now? And more importantly, was he still out there? The forest was colder that night than Alan remembered. As he stepped out of his truck, a heavy fog coiled low over the mossy ground, muting every sound beneath a blanket of stillness. The deputies had floodlights set up around the cabin, casting long, twitching shadows across the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Deputy Claire met him near the porch, her face pale beneath her cap. "You need to see this, Sheriff," she said, barely above a whisper. Alan followed her inside. The air was thicker now, as if the building itself resented being disturbed. The floor had been partially removed in the corner, the planks pried up with crowbars. A rectangular pit had been unearthed beneath the foundation, about 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. The dirt inside was darker, wetter, freshly disturbed. Briggs crouched, shining his flashlight into the pit. What he saw nearly stopped his heart. A small shoe, caked in mud, faded pink, with a cartoon butterfly on the side. It was unmistakably a child's. Nearby, buried just beneath the soil, was a rusted tin lunchbox. Alan reached down with gloved hands and lifted it out, his fingers trembling. The latch snapped with a metallic pop. Inside were scraps of paper, some torn from coloring books, others scribbled in crayon. One had a single sentence in shaky handwriting. "If you find this, please tell my mom I try to be brave." Alan couldn't speak. The deputies around him were silent too, the weight of the moment falling over them like ash. But it wasn't just the shoe or the note. Beneath the lunchbox, carefully wrapped in plastic, was a collection of small bones. Human remains. A child's. Alan's breath caught. "We need the coroner. Now. Secure everything." As the call went out, he stood slowly, his chest heavy with dread. This wasn't Emily. He knew it instinctively. The shoe was newer than the year she vanished, and the bones too small. This was another child, another victim. "God help us," he muttered under his breath. This wasn't just about Emily. Deputy Claire swallowed hard. "What do you think this means?" Alan turned toward her, voice grim. "It means Marcus Thorne didn't just take one girl." He looked around the cabin again, at the chains, the scribbles on the wall, the hidden room, the second grave. This was his hunting ground. Claire's eyes widened. "You think he's still doing it?" Alan nodded, jaw tight. "If he's alive, yes. And we just opened the door to a much bigger nightmare." Just then, another deputy approached, holding something wrapped in a plastic bag. "Sheriff," this was under the bed frame. He handed it over. Alan unwrapped the cloth and revealed a Polaroid photo. It showed a girl with messy blonde hair sitting in the corner of a wooden room, eyes red from crying, face smeared with dirt. But behind her on the wall was something that made his blood run cold. A date, September 14th, 2017, 7 years after Emily vanished. He stared at the photo in horror. This wasn't Emily either. It was someone else, which meant the monster in these woods had taken more than one child. And they were already years too late. Alan Briggs drove back to the station with the Polaroid clutched in his hand like it might vanish if he let it go. His mind was racing, pushing past exhaustion, shoving fear aside, focused only on what the evidence meant. This wasn't just Emily's story anymore. This was bigger, far darker, and buried deeper than any of them had imagined. The photo was proof of another girl, another life snatched away, and it hinted at a horrifying pattern. Marcus Thorne hadn't acted once. He'd repeated it, methodically, over years. That meant there could be more. Victims who never got the attention Emily did. Forgotten faces. Cases dismissed as runaways. Alan reached the station, stormed inside, and called up the regional missing persons database. He started with the year on the photo, 2017. He filtered for girls between the ages of 6 and 12, missing within a 100-mile radius of Grayson Hollow. For results, one in particular made his stomach drop. Lily Harper, age 9, disappeared from a campground just 40 miles north of Grayson Hollow on September 13th, 2017, the day before the date on the photo. Her picture matched the girl in the Polaroid. Same hair, same eyes, same freckle near her left cheek. No leads were ever found. Her parents believed she was taken while playing near the edge of the woods. Alan's hand clenched into a fist. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern, a cycle. Marcus had a method. He took young girls who were alone, vanished into the wilderness, and kept them hidden, underground, out of sight beneath decaying wood and rotting cabins. He didn't just kill. He held them, played with their minds, broke them slowly. Alan leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo again. If Lily was here in 2017, and Emily in 2009, what about the years in between? How many others? Had he done this before Emily? After Lily? Was there another somewhere right now? Still alive? Waiting? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Deputy Claire, her face pale. "Sheriff, there's something you need to see." One of the texts enhanced the other side of the Polaroid. "We didn't notice it at first, but there's something in the background." Alan followed her to the evidence room, where a monitor displayed the enhanced image. Behind Lily, barely visible in the shadows, was the outline of another person. Taller, lean, wearing a hood, his face obscured, but unmistakably there. Watching. The angle suggested a second mirror or reflective surface, like the photo had accidentally captured his image behind her. Alan stared at it, his jaw clenched. Even blurred, even hidden in shadow, the presence felt wrong. Predatory. Calculated. "That's him," he muttered. "Marcus Thorne." Claire asked the obvious question, her voice barely steady. "But if he's in the photo, who took it?" Alan didn't answer, because in that moment, one terrifying thought burrowed into his mind and took hold. What if Marcus wasn't alone? Alan barely slept. The idea that Marcus Thorne might not have been working alone gnawed at his thoughts like rats in the dark. Every lead he followed now had to widen. Every missing child, every shadowy tip, every unexplained sighting in the forest. He began mapping the disappearances, Emily, Lily, and others going back over 2 decades. What he saw chilled him. All the abductions formed a rough arc, each incident creeping slowly through the wilderness as if following some hidden path through the trees. These weren't random acts. They were planned, controlled, as if someone had studied the land, understood its secrets, and used the forest itself as a trap. The next morning, Alan returned to the cabin, joined by forensic teams and a cadaver dog. The dog was restless, tail stiff, nose twitching violently near the eastern edge of the property, right where a crumbling trail disappeared into dense thickets. The air was heavy with decay, but something else lingered. The scent of movement. Something recent. Alan ordered the team to expand the search grid and follow the overgrown trail. Less than a mile in, they discovered a collapsed hunting blind camouflaged with branches. Inside, they found discarded food wrappers, a rusted lantern, and a pile of chewed fingernails, small, clearly from a child. Someone had been watching from here, waiting, and they had done it more than once. One of the deputies, scanning the trees, froze. "Sheriff," he said, voice cracking. Alan turned. Etched into the bark of a nearby tree was a crudely carved message. "She cried too much." Fresh, carved with a knife that hadn't rusted yet. Alan stepped closer and saw a second line, just below it. "You're getting close." The forest suddenly felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Alan spun, eyes searching the tree line, hand on his holster. Nothing moved, but the threat was real now, no longer buried in the past, but awake and aware. Whoever had written that message was watching them. Maybe had been watching all along, and they were bold enough to leave a taunt right in their path. Back at the station, Alan called in reinforcements, state investigators, canine units, helicopters. But as the sun dipped behind the treetops that evening, he stood at the edge of the woods and realized something horrifying. The man they were hunting didn't fear discovery. He'd prepared for it. For years. These woods weren't just his hiding place. They were his domain. And now that Alan was coming for him, he wasn't running. He was inviting them in. And deep inside, Alan knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, as moonlight filtered dimly through the blinds of his office, Alan sat hunched over the evidence table, surrounded by photographs, maps, and files stretching back 20 years. He played the Polaroid image over in his mind again and again. The figure in the reflection, the haunted look in Lily's eyes, the date. Every piece of it was another thread leading into the black heart of the forest. But he needed more. Something concrete. Something that spoke. And that's when Deputy Clare stepped in holding a dusty, old cassette tape in a sealed evidence bag. "We found it buried under the floorboards, inside a locked box beneath a false panel," she said, setting it down. There were claw marks on the wood, like someone tried to dig it out. Alan carefully cut the seal and slid the tape into the old recorder on a shelf. He pressed play. A moment of static hissed, then a child's voice, soft, scared, echoed in the small office. "Day 14. He said I could go home today, but he lied again." Alan froze. "It's cold. I don't like the dark. Sometimes he talks to someone who isn't there. I hear them whisper through the walls. I think there's another girl. She cries when I'm asleep." Another burst of static, then a different voice. Deep, raspy, almost amused. "She's learning, just like the others. I told you the forest chooses who stays. If you're quiet, you'll see her too. She walks between the trees. She watches us." Then silence. Alan's heart pounded. There wasn't just a man behind this. There was something else in his mind, something he believed was guiding him. Whether it was delusion or darkness beyond explanation, Marcus hadn't acted alone in his head. He'd built a world for these girls, a twisted mythology where the forest itself participated in his madness. Claire whispered, "Do you think the other girl he mentioned was Lily?" "Maybe," Alan replied, his voice low. "Or maybe there were more. Too many to count." They played the rest of the tape. Near the end, the same child's voice returned, weaker now, If someone finds this, tell my brother I remember his stories. The ones with the brave knight. I pretended I was her. I tried to fight, but I'm tired now. Please tell Mom I'm not scared anymore." A tear slipped down Alan's cheek. That girl had fought to be heard. And now, finally, someone was listening. He turned to Claire. "We release this recording to the media. Maybe someone will recognize her voice. Maybe a family out there is still hoping. But what if the killer hears it too?" Alan's eyes narrowed. "Good. Let him know we're coming." Just then, another deputy rushed into the office, face pale. "Sheriff, we just got a tip. A man matching Marcus Thorne's description was spotted 2 counties over, near the edge of Black Hollow Preserve. He was talking to a little girl. Then they vanished into the trees." Alan stood instantly, grabbing his jacket. "Mobilize everyone. We go now." The hunt was no longer just about Emily. The forest had taken too many children, and Alan was ready to tear it apart, tree by tree, to bring them home. The convoy of patrol vehicles snaked through the winding country roads as the sky dimmed with thick clouds, casting the landscape in a steel blue hue. Sheriff Alan Briggs sat behind the wheel of the lead SUV, his jaw tight, hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The name Black Hollow Preserve rang with ominous familiarity. Locals spoke of it in whispers, a stretch of wilderness even hunters avoided, filled with stories of strange disappearances, flickering lights, and eerie silence that made compasses spin and birds fall quiet. The last known sighting of Marcus Thorne, or the man resembling him, had placed him near the southern edge of that preserve, walking with a small girl who had since vanished. No one had seen them come back. Alan refused to let another child disappear into the trees. As they reached the preserve's boundary, the team disembarked, weapons holstered but ready, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The wind rustled the canopy above, and with every step deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop. It felt like walking into a grave. They found the girl's footprints first, small, light, heading deeper into the forest. Then, heavier boot prints following close behind. They tracked them for nearly an hour until the ground shifted, leading them into a narrow gully choked with moss and vines. That's when they saw it, an old root cellar door, half buried beneath leaves and branches, hidden like a mouth waiting to be opened. Alan approached slowly, hand resting on his holstered pistol. The door creaked open with effort, revealing a steep stairwell descending into pitch black. The smell hit them instantly, damp earth, mildew, and something far worse, the unmistakable metallic scent of blood. Alan flicked on his flashlight and descended, every footstep echoing through the darkness. The cellar was larger than expected, with crudely dug side chambers. In one, they found chains. In another, children's clothing folded in neat piles. And then, carved into the stone wall at the back of the farthest chamber, they found names, scratched by fingernails and small hands. Emily, Lily, and more. Names they hadn't even known to search for. But beneath those, one name was fresh, the scratch marks still white in the rock. Sophie. Alan turned to Claire. "That's the girl from the tip." A soft noise behind them made them spin, rustling fabric, a breath, the soft scuff of bare feet. Flashlights swept the room, and there, half hidden behind a wooden beam, stood a little girl in a torn pink sweater, wide-eyed, trembling, her face pale but very much alive. "Sophie," Alan asked gently, lowering his light. She nodded slowly, then burst into tears. Claire rushed forward, wrapping her in a blanket and pulling her close. But before they could celebrate, a voice echoed faintly through the cellar tunnels, low, gravelly, and humming an old lullaby. Alan signaled the team. The real storm was still coming. Marcus, or whoever he was now, hadn't left. He was watching, waiting, and they had just walked into his home. The soft melody drifted through the tunnels like a ghost's breath, an old lullaby, off-key, slow, almost mechanical. Alan's heart thudded heavily in his chest as he raised his hand, motioning for the others to stay still. Claire kept Sophie pressed to her chest, whispering calming words, but the child's small body trembled violently. The humming was moving, first from one corridor, then another, circling them like a predator in the dark. Alan clicked off his flashlight, plunging himself into shadow. The others followed. They listened. No footsteps, no voice, just the lullaby wrapping around them like smoke. Then a click, metal against stone. Alan turned sharply, his instinct screaming. "Move!" he shouted, but the floor beneath his boots gave way with a sharp groan and a thunderous crash. The old earth caved in, swallowing him and two other deputies into a deeper chamber below. Dust and rock rained down. Darkness closed in. Alan hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder as he rolled to his side. Distant voices shouted above, muffled. He was alive, but separated. His flashlight flickered back on, revealing the chamber's walls lined with jars, photographs, trinkets, mementos of the stolen. A shrine to sickness. In the corner was an old mattress, stained and ripped. Beside it sat a tape recorder, already playing. "You finally made it, Sheriff," the voice rasped from the speaker. "You followed the breadcrumbs. You saw my art. But you're still looking at the wrong monster. I didn't take those girls. I saved them from her." Alan stared at the recorder, breath caught. "She lives in the trees. The pale lady. She talks through the girls. They whisper in their sleep. And when they vanish, it's because she calls them." Static burst. Then another voice, lighter, a child's, cut in. "Help us." Alan turned. That didn't come from the recorder. It came from the dark hallway beyond the chamber. He rose, drawing his sidearm, and began to move. Slowly, quietly. Meanwhile above, Claire secured Sophie and organized the rescue rope. Deputies worked furiously to lower it down, shouting to Alan. But he wasn't answering. Not anymore. Because deep below, as Alan followed the sound of the child's voice, the walls around him began to change. Scratches lined every surface. Symbols, spirals, handprints. Some were impossibly high, as if made by something that could float. The air grew colder, thicker. Then, at the end of the corridor, Alan found another door, older than the cabin, made of iron and wood, bound with chains. From inside came a whisper, barely audible. "She's still here." Alan placed his hand on the lock. It wasn't locked, and as he pulled the door open, the darkness inside breathed. The moment the door creaked open, a breath of icy air rushed past Alan's face, smelling of damp moss and something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. His flashlight flickered again as if protesting, its beam dancing wildly across the chamber ahead. The room wasn't like the others. It was round, domed, the ceiling arched like a cathedral, carved with spirals and strange runes that shimmered faintly even in the low light. In the center stood a stone altar, and on it, a crude wooden figure, a woman with hollow eyes, her arms stretched toward the ceiling, her mouth open in a silent scream. Around the base were small objects, ribbons, teeth, hair braided into cords. Alan stepped closer, every instinct in his body screaming to turn back, but something deeper drove him forward, a pull stronger than reason. That's when he heard it again, whispers, not from one voice, but many, overlapping, murmuring from every corner of the chamber. Girls' voices, pleading, crying, calling for help. He turned in a slow circle, gun raised, but no one was there. Then the temperature dropped again, so fast that his breath fogged instantly. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, behind him, a voice, clear, female, cold. "You shouldn't have come." He turned, and she was there. Not in flesh, but in shadow. Tall, thin, impossibly pale, her long hair hanging like wet vines, her eyes black voids that swallowed the light. The pale lady. She stepped from the stone, not walking but gliding, her fingers trailing along the air as if slicing through unseen fabric. "They were mine," she whispered, her voice echoing in his skull. "They called to me." He only opened the door. Alan raised his gun. "Let them go." She laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "You don't understand. They're already part of the forest. They chose to stay." The runes on the walls began to glow brighter, casting eerie light across the chamber. Faces formed in the stone. Young girls, dozens of them, all watching Alan, their expressions blank. then one step forward from the wall. Not in shadow, not in mist, but solid. Real. A young girl with tangled hair and hollow eyes. "Sheriff," she said in a soft voice. "Help us." More faces began to shift, reaching toward him. Not to harm, but to be freed. Alan realized then that whatever the pale lady was, spirit, monster, madness, she had bound these souls here. And something in this room, something within the altar or the carvings, held them like a prison. He looked down at the figure, the wooden idol on the altar. At its base, half buried beneath the offerings, was a small notebook. He grabbed it, flipping it open. Inside were drawings, Lily's drawings. Pictures of the pale lady, of the cabin, of girls trapped behind trees. And on the last page, in shaky handwriting, "Break her face. Free the voices." Without thinking, Alan raised his flashlight and smashed it into the wooden figure's face. The wood cracked, splintered, and with a shriek that split the chamber, the pale lady screamed, her form unraveling like smoke torn apart by wind. The faces in the stone gasped, blinked, and then began to vanish one by one. The light faded. The chamber trembled. Dust rained down. And the whispers, those pleading voices, fell silent at last. Alan staggered back, chest heaving, ears ringing. He had broken the idol. He had freed them. But as the chamber began to collapse around him, he realized he wasn't alone. A hand reached down into the darkness, Claire's. "Sheriff, grab it." He lunged, catching her wrist just as the floor gave way beneath his feet. With a grunt, she pulled him up. Sophie huddled beside her, eyes wide with fear but alive. Behind them, the old cellar roared as it caved in, burying the twisted altar and whatever remnants of darkness still lingered below. Alan collapsed on the ground outside, gasping, staring up at the sky now streaked with early morning light. The forest had grown quiet. Not dead, just still. And in that silence, he heard it, a soft voice in the wind, no longer crying but whispering, "Thank you." The first hints of dawn crept slowly through the towering trees, casting long golden rays across the forest floor as Alan, Claire, and Sophie stumbled out from beneath the shattered remains of the cellar. The smoke from the fires still clung to their clothes, a haunting scent of burnt wood and damp moss. But the nightmare had broken. Sophie's tiny hand gripped Claire's fingers so tightly her knuckles had turned white, but she didn't let go, not even for a second. Her wide eyes, rimmed with soot and tears, looked out at the forest with a strange mix of awe and fear, as if unsure whether she had truly escaped the darkness or was still trapped in one of the pale lady's twisted illusions. Alan moved ahead, clearing the path as best he could, his every step heavy with exhaustion, but his mind remained sharply focused on the girl they had just rescued. Every time she murmured something under her breath, disjointed memories, scattered words about the cellar, the trees, the lady with no feet, Alan listened carefully. It was clear Sophie's mind had been fractured by what she endured, but it was also clear that she had seen things no child should ever have to comprehend. She spoke of other voices down there, not all of them human. She described the pale lady not as a monster, but as a shadow that sang lullabies through the walls, a whisper that promised peace and silence. She said the pale lady didn't hurt her, not like Marcus had, but she kept her there, hidden like a bird in a box, feeding her strange food and telling her stories about the forest that breathed and the roots that listened. Claire's face darkened with every word, and Alan could see the horror growing in her eyes. This wasn't just about a madman who had kidnapped a little girl. This was about something else, something ancient and wrong, something that lived in the woods and fed off sorrow. When they finally reached the clearing near the trailhead, search and rescue teams were already there. Shouts erupted as they spotted the group. Paramedics rushed forward, blankets and stretchers ready. But Alan held up his hand, keeping them back just long enough for Sophie to take it all in. The sunlight struck her face, and she blinked rapidly, as though the light itself hurt her. Then, for the first time, her lips trembled into something faintly resembling a smile. She had survived. Back in town, the church bells rang for the first time in years. Not for a funeral, but for a miracle. Reporters swarmed the area. Questions were screamed. Cameras clicked. Alan shielded Sophie as best he could, his body forming a barrier between her and the chaos of the world she had forgotten. The townspeople, stunned by the impossible, gathered along the sidewalks, many of them in tears. Claire whispered gently to Sophie, keeping her grounded, telling her it was okay. She was safe now. The Pale Lady couldn't reach her here. But Alan knew something deeper. He knew that whatever the Pale Lady had been, ghost, curse, spirit, or something worse, she hadn't just haunted the forest. She had been part of it, woven into its roots and leaves, born from its grief. Marcus Thorne might have built the prison, but the forest had become the warden. As the sun rose fully above the trees, Alan turned back one last time toward the dense line of pine that had swallowed so many over the years. The whispers had stopped. The air felt lighter. But he couldn't shake the sense that the forest was still watching, that it had simply chosen, for now, to let them go. And deep in his gut, Alan knew the Pale Lady's story was not over. Not yet. The days that followed Sophie's return were filled with a blur of doctor's appointments, media headlines, and emotional reunions. The town hailed it as a miracle, and to many it was. One child returned after years, pulled from the belly of the forest and the grip of a ghost story that had haunted Black Hollow for generations. But behind the tears of joy and the celebratory headlines, Alan couldn't shake the weight that pressed on his chest. Something remained unresolved, like a missing puzzle piece buried too deep in the dirt. Sophie's fragmented memories spoke of other children, faint voices echoing in the dark, names she could barely pronounce, and lullabies that weren't hers. It was more than trauma. It was a thread leading deeper into something that hadn't yet been uncovered. While the authorities closed their reports with Marcus Thorne named as the sole perpetrator, Alan remained unconvinced. He combed through historical town records, scanned old property maps, and even visited the local library's long-forgotten archives. What he found made his blood run cold. Generations ago, before Black Hollow even had a name, settlers spoke of a woman in white who wandered the woods, mourning her children lost in a fire. The land where Thorne's cabin stood had once belonged to a widow named Eliza Whitaker, whose 3 daughters had vanished during a brutal winter in 1821. Her grief drove her mad, the records claimed, and she had disappeared into the forest, never seen again. Whispers from old journals told of a pale woman with hollow eyes who would appear on cold nights, asking passers-by, "Have you seen my girls?" Alan wasn't sure whether to believe it, but he couldn't ignore the parallels. He returned to the site of the collapsed cabin, now reduced to blackened rubble, and spent hours walking its perimeter. Something drew him to the edge of the property where a cluster of trees stood too tightly together, roots woven like arms in an embrace. He began digging, not out of logic but instinct, until the shovel struck something hard. Bones, small, delicate, unmistakably human. There were no markings, no coffins, only shallow graves covered in stone and moss. Alan stood frozen, heart pounding, realizing these were the lost children Sophie had heard. Not ghosts, but victims, forgotten by time, hidden by earth, and only remembered by the forest and its eternal guardian. He reported the findings, and the authorities confirmed the truth. 5 small skeletons, likely over a century old. The town was shaken to its core. The headlines changed. What began as a kidnapping case turned into something darker, deeper. The legend of the Pale Lady wasn't just a story used to scare children. She had once been real, a mother driven mad by grief, bound to the land by sorrow, so strong it had bent the laws of the living. And Marcus Thorne? He had merely fed the cycle, manipulating an already cursed place for his own sick purposes. Alan visited Sophie afterward and gently told her what he had found. She stared at him quietly, and then, in a soft, almost reverent voice, whispered, "She just wanted someone to remember." Alan nodded, understanding now. The Pale Lady hadn't been seeking revenge. She had been seeking peace. And with her story unearthed and her children finally known to the world, that peace had finally become possible. But even as the town exhaled a long-held breath, Alan remained vigilant. The forest had returned to silence, but it was not the silence of forgetfulness. It was the silence of respect and, perhaps, release. In the weeks that followed, Black Hollow slowly returned to a fragile kind of normal. The forest, once feared, now stood as both a graveyard and a place of remembrance. The townspeople no longer whispered of the pale lady with trembling voices, but instead spoke of Eliza Whitaker with a strange, almost reverent sadness. A memorial was built on the edge of the woods where Alan had uncovered the children's remains. A stone circle etched with 5 names, the best guesses drawn from what few historical records remained. People came with flowers, candles, and quiet prayers, not out of superstition, but out of recognition. Recognition of suffering, of history long buried, and of the souls caught between this world and the next. Sophie's recovery was slow but steady. She rarely spoke of the cabin anymore, but when she did, it was always in dreams, murmured sentences while she slept, fragments of songs, or whispers of wind through trees. Claire stayed by her side, fiercely protective, never letting go of her daughter's hand for more than a moment. She had nearly lost her once, and she wouldn't risk it again. Therapists worked with Sophie, gently helping her separate truth from nightmare, memory from myth. But some parts never fully unwound. There were still moments when Sophie would stop mid-sentence, staring off toward the trees with a look of recognition that sent chills through Alan. One afternoon, Sophie asked if she could visit the memorial. Claire hesitated, but Alan agreed to take her. Together, they walked through the now-cleared path, sunlight filtering through the canopy above, leaves rustling gently, as if the forest itself was sighing. When they reached the stone circle, Sophie didn't cry. She simply knelt, placed a small handmade doll at the base of the largest stone, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Then she stood, took Alan's hand, and walked away. That night, Alan stood alone on his porch, the cool breeze rustling through the trees behind his home. He thought of everything. The pale lady's sorrow, Marcus Thorne's cruelty, the long-forgotten history that had finally come to light. He wondered how much of it had been supernatural, how much simply the madness of grief, and how much would never be understood. But he knew one thing. Whatever haunted Black Hollow had lost its grip. The cycle had been broken not with fire or force, but with truth, compassion, and remembrance. And in doing so, they had given peace not only to the lost souls of the past, but to the living ones who carried the scars. Alan finally felt something he hadn't in years. Not relief, not triumph, but peace. A deep, still peace, like the forest after a long storm. The kind that settles into your bones and lets you sleep through the night. For the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of shadows. Seasons changed. The snow that once blanketed the woods in eerie silence gave way to a gentle spring, and with it came new life. Grass sprouted between the memorial stones, birds returned to the trees, and laughter, once absent, echoed faintly from nearby trails. For the first time in years, families walked the edges of Black Hollow without clutching their children in fear. The woods had not forgotten, but they had forgiven. Alan visited Sophie and Claire often. Their house, once quiet and shuttered in grief, now felt alive again. Sophie had taken to drawing, her sketchbook full of trees, cabins, and swirling shapes that seemed to carry both light and shadow. She drew the faces of children she remembered, not as ghosts, but as friends, smiling beneath canopies of green leaves. Alan watched her grow stronger with each passing day, and every so often, she would look at him with those sharp, knowing eyes and smile in a way that told him she remembered far more than she ever spoke aloud. But that was okay. Some stories were meant to stay in the heart. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, Sophie handed Alan a drawing. It was of the memorial, with the 5 stones arranged like petals of a flower. Standing beside them was the faint outline of a woman in white, no longer weeping, but smiling peacefully with her eyes closed, hands gently folded over her heart. At her feet were 5 small children, holding hands, laughing. "She's happy now," Sophie said. Alan felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot that had been there for too long. He nodded and promised to frame the drawing and hang it in the town's library where the old history books used to gather dust. "So, people remember?" Sophie asked. "Exactly," Alan said. "So people remember." The townspeople continued to leave flowers at the memorial. The local school started teaching a short unit on Black Hollow's past, not as a tale of terror, but as a lesson in compassion, in facing darkness with truth and heart. Alan retired from the ranger service that summer, choosing instead to lead guided walks through the woods, sharing its beauty, its stories, and its rebirth. Claire began volunteering at a trauma center, helping other families cope with missing loved ones, and Sophie, well, she just kept growing. She laughed louder, ran faster, and carried within her a quiet strength forged in shadow and polished in light. One night, under a sky full of stars, Alan sat once more on his porch. The breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. From the distance, he heard the faint echo of a girl's laughter. Real or imagined, he didn't care. He simply smiled. The woods would always remember what had happened there, but they would also remember the ones who came back. And more importantly, the ones who helped others find their way home. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales that stay with you long after the last word.